Larry William Eyler, a serial killer who committed multiple horrific murders in the Midwest, traversed the highways in a pickup truck in the early 1980s, luring young male sex workers, homosexuals, and hitchhikers into his vehicle, and subsequently he would then transport them to isolated locations where he would proceed to strangle them, sexually assault them, and subsequently murder and dismember them before discarding their remains in rural areas and in proximity to highways. So he's known as the highway killer and the interstate killer. Larry was born on December 21st, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana. His father was an alcoholic who was often violent towards his family. So 2 years later, Larry's mother divorced. She works 2 jobs a day to support her children, but the source of funds is very unstable. These 4 children were fostered in someone else's home or hired to take care of the children. Larry often gets picked on at school. Even though he's good at sports, his classmates still pick on him because of his family's financial situation and his mom's not around much. His sister Teresa is the only one who helps him out, so Larry thinks she and his mom are the closest people to him. By 1974, Larry's mother had been married 4 times. She was an unfortunate woman who had always encountered men who enjoyed alcoholism and domestic violence. The 4 children followed their mother and were abused and beaten to varying degrees by several stepfathers. One of the stepfathers reportedly liked to discipline Larry by forcing his head into hot water. The repeated physical and emotional abuse caused Larry to develop some pretty abnormal mental issues. His mother took him for a psychological evaluation, which showed that he was severely insecure and also feared being abandoned by his family. A psychologist recommended that Larry be placed in a boys' home, thinking that his mental state could be cured in that environment. After 6 months of living there, though, it was clear that Larry hadn't changed. Adolescence is often a time when people's minds are particularly sensitive. Larry entered puberty and knew he was gay. He then told his family about his sexuality and made it clear that he was disgusted by his homosexuality. During high school, Larry dated girls on and off, but it didn't change his preference for men. He had to accept that he was gay. Academically, Larry struggled in school and didn't graduate. He passed a test to receive a General Educational Development Certificate. After leaving school, Larry got a job as a security guard at Marion County General Hospital. He worked there for 6 months before being fired and then became a shoe store salesman. During this time, Larry was a regular at the local gay community and gay bars, where he felt very comfortable and made friends quickly. On the surface, Larry comes across as a very nice person. However, due to his youthful experiences, he has a twisted heart that is an irrevocable fact, which is only discovered by his sexual partners. Larry is violent in bed and swears and tries to kill people. Some of the homosexuals he dated said that Larry would even gently cut their skin with a knife so that he could get the greatest physical satisfaction. In August 1981, Larry began a long-term relationship with a 20-year-old man named John Dobrovolskis. John was married, but the relationship between them was strong and lasted a long time. Both men were looking for comfort and fulfillment in the relationship. They both enjoy sadomasochism, and they often have sex while Larry ties his partner to the bed, beats and whips him, and curses at John. Larry and John are not looking for a monogamous relationship, but they are certain that theirs will last. Larry demanded commitment from John. He demanded that John be the only male partner in his life, but they often argued over Larry's allegations of infidelity. These arguments sometimes escalated into physical attacks on Larry by John, but Larry never fought back. Their relationship was occasionally strained by the opinions of third parties, especially Robert Little. Robert is a professor at Indiana State University who's close with Larry. They don't rely on physical communication, but rather platonic, spiritual emotions. He, on the other hand, has no respect for John and is upset that Larry maintains a long-term relationship with him. Larry's main job is as a house painter in Illinois, but he also works at a liquor store in Greencastle, Indiana. He often travels between the 2 states and stays at Robert's home in Terre Haute on weekends. On August 3, 1978, Larry picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Craig Long on 7th Street in Terre Haute. Not long after Craig got into Larry's pickup truck, Larry suddenly made a sexual advance towards him. After Craig refused, Larry drove straight to a remote field and ordered Craig to remove his clothes. He was handcuffed and tied at the ankles before being made to climb into the back of the pickup. Craig then tried to run away and yell for help as Larry got ready to undress. But because his hands and feet were tied up, Larry caught up with him and stabbed him in the chest with a knife, which caused a punctured lung. Craig then fell to the ground and pretended to be dead. He waited until Larry left and went to a nearby house, where residents called emergency personnel for him. Not long after, Larry rushed back to his car and gave the handcuff keys to a sheriff's deputy, saying he'd stabbed Craig by mistake. The police didn't believe Larry's story and arrested him. When they searched his vehicle, they found a hunting knife, metal spiked whip, butcher knife, another set of handcuffs, tear gas, and a sword, among other things. But they didn't think it was a big deal. Larry was later charged with attempted murder. A judge set his bail at $10,000, which was raised by his family and some gay friends. Larry's attorney also offered Craig a check for $2,500 from Robert, asking him to agree not to press charges against Larry, which Craig accepted. As a result, Larry was acquitted on November 13th and fined only $43 in court costs. On October 23, 1982, Larry abducted 19-year-old Stephen Crockett. He lured Stephen into his car and took him to a cornfield in Kankakee, Illinois, where he beat Stephen and stabbed him to death. Stephen's body was found about 12 hours after he was killed. The autopsy showed he had 32 stab wounds, including 4 to the head. This was Larry's first known murder. Just a few days later, on October 30th, 1982, 26-year-old Edgar Underkoffler went missing in Rutland, Illinois. His body was found on March 4th, 1983, in a field in nearby Danville, Illinois, where Edgar's body had suffered the same stab wounds. After Larry committed the crime, he discarded Edgar's original shoes and socks and dressed Edgar in a pair of short white socks. In November 1982, Larry murdered 25-year-old bartender John Johnson. His body was found a month later in Lowell, Indiana. Right after that, on November 20th, 1982, Larry abducted 19-year-old hitchhiker William Lewis near Vincennes, Indiana. He killed him in a fit of rage and buried him in a field near Rensselaer, Indiana. On December 19, 1982, 23-year-old Stephen Egan was abducted by Larry in Terre Haute. His body was found on December 28th in a wooded area near Indiana Highway 63, in an area near Rensselaer, Indiana. Local investigators examined an abandoned farm outbuilding near the crime scene and discovered multiple bloodstains on plaster-damaged walls. They were certain that Larry had hung Egan from the wall before killing him. The coroner who performed the autopsy also noted severe stab wounds to Egan's abdomen, chest, and throat. They stated definitively that the killer was not consistent in how violent he was with his victims because the same person would not have varied that much. But in Egan's case, they were certain there was more than one killer. The coroner performed an autopsy on John Roach, age 21, immediately after concluding their examination of Egan. Roach's body was found near I-70 in Putnam County. The coroner stated that the injuries sustained by Roach and Egan were strikingly similar. They noted multiple stab wounds to the victim's abdomen, upper chest, and throat. It was not clear to the local police until this point that the two cases were caused by a serial killer. David Block, a 22-year-old Yale graduate, went missing in Highland Park, Illinois, on December 30th, 1983. He informed his family that he was going to visit a friend in a nearby city, but he never showed up. His body was found on May 7, 1984, by a farmer in a field near Illinois Route 173. On January 24, 1983, Larry kidnapped 16-year-old Irvin Gibson. The body of Gibson was found in a field in Lake County, Illinois, on April 15th, along with a dog that had also been stabbed to death. Larry is believed to have killed at least 5 other people between March and April 1983, which was the height of his serial killing spree. The brutal and random nature of these murders caused great fear in the community at the time, and rightfully so. On May 9th, Daniel Scott McNeve's body was found in a field near Indiana Highway 39. He had 11 stab wounds to his neck, 5 to his back, and 11 to his abdomen. One of the wounds had caused his small intestines to protrude. His abdomen was also cut. In addition, McNeve had cuts on his wrists and ankles, and his jeans were pulled up to his ankles. However, there were no signs of sexual assault on his body. 9 days later, Larry also murdered 25-year-old Richard Bruce. His body was dumped into a creek in Effingham, Illinois, where it was not found until December 5th. In early 1983, members of the gay community in Indiana observed a sudden increase in the disappearances and murders of young males. They were certain that a serial killer was responsible. In response to this situation, law enforcement officials raided gay bars and bookstores and publicly photographed patrons to identify and track down possible suspects. The gay newspaper The Works took it upon themselves to assist the police by creating an anonymous telephone hotline and publishing an article on the identity and motivations of the perpetrator. The article stated that the killer was likely struggling to come to terms with his sexual orientation. In early spring of 1983, the Indiana State Police finally established a connection between the murders of several young males in the state, which exhibited similar wounds, suggesting that a single perpetrator was responsible. After the body of one of the victims was discovered, the Indiana State Police called a meeting of 35 detectives from 4 jurisdictions where the bodies of young males had similar wounds. The meeting concluded with a clear determination: the same person had been murdered in each jurisdiction. It was therefore decided that all those involved in the investigation should form a unified task force to apprehend the suspects. The 4 separate murder investigations in Indiana were consolidated into a unified task force comprising the state police, the Indianapolis Police Department, and 2 detectives from each county involved in the manhunt. This task force, designated the Central Indiana Multi-Agency Investigative Team, was led by Lt. Jerry Campbell of the Indianapolis Police Department. All information gathered was entered into a computerized database integrated with the statewide police system. On the first day of the investigative team's existence, they contacted the FBI's National Crime Information Center. They provided a detailed account of the murder and body disposal methods employed by the offenders they were seeking, and formally requested that law enforcement agencies that had discovered young male murder victims with wounds consistent with those observed in previous incidents contact them. The task force was subsequently contacted by investigators in Kentucky, who reported that a 29-year-old Lexington resident, Jay Reynolds, had been found stabbed to death on March 22nd in Madison County. A few days later, investigators in Chicago reported that the body of an 18-year-old African-American teenager named Jimmy Roberts had been found on May 9th with 35 stab wounds. At this point, the investigative team was certain that the serial killer was not merely perpetrating crimes within the confines of Indiana. It was clear that he was traversing various states and continuing to commit offenses on an ongoing basis. On June 6th, Larry's former romantic partner contacted the investigative team's confidential hotline, indicating a clear suspicion that Larry was the perpetrator they were seeking. He provided a detailed account of the 1978 incident, in which Larry was accused of stabbing a young hitchhiker. He also provided information on Larry's violent temper and penchant for restraints. Furthermore, it was confirmed that Larry worked at a liquor store in Greencastle on Saturdays and lived in Terre Haute with an older male on weekends, which allowed him to travel between locations. Furthermore, the informant confirmed that in May 1982, Larry had drugged a 14-year-old boy and left the unconscious teenager in a wooded area near Greencastle. At this point, the FBI created a psychological profile of the serial killer. They determined that he was a white male in his late 20s or early 30s. He was employed in a menial profession. He had an outwardly rough demeanor. He killed because he hated the sexual attractiveness of other males. This anomalous emotion led him to express hatred of homosexuals to disguise his sexual attraction to those seeking acceptance. Furthermore, the FBI hypothesizes that during the initial murders, this serial killer attempted to conceal the bodies of his victims with leaves and dirt, but that this evidence was subsequently obliterated. This evidence points to the involvement of an accomplice in the initial murders. Furthermore, the fact that many of the victims were of a very slim build indicates that this criminal was significantly stronger than them, a claim supported by the strangulation marks on their wrists. On July 2, 1983, the partial body of an unidentified Hispanic man was found in a field 2 miles outside the city of Paxton in Ford County, Illinois. On August 31st, a tree trimmer discovered the body of another victim, 28-year-old Ralph Calais, in a field near Illinois Route 60. On September 8th, investigators added all 5 victims from both states to the list of victims they had already compiled, which now included the names of 17 young males. On October 4th, 1983, 2 hunters discovered a human body hidden in a plastic bag in a field in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. The victim, Eric Hansen, was 18 years old and was last seen on September 27th. The body was found in downtown Milwaukee. The hacksaw attack definitively severed the victim's head, arms, and legs from his torso. The torso had been completely drained of blood, and the skull and hands were never found. On December 7th, 1983, a hunter discovered part of another victim's skeleton in Hendricks County, near U.S. Route 40. The victim was identified as 17-year-old Richard Wayne, who had disappeared in Montpelier, Indiana, on March 20th, while traveling from California to his home. The investigative team found the body of a second victim just a few feet from where Wayne was buried. This victim was determined to be African American and about 5 feet 9 inches tall. Larry was arrested in Lowell, Indiana on September 30th, 1983 for a traffic violation. He was with a young hitchhiker at the time, and the two were taken to the Lowell State Police for questioning. Larry was charged with soliciting young males for sexual purposes, and his vehicle was impounded because the police found 2 pieces of nylon rope in his Ford F-Series pickup truck. Later that afternoon, 2 investigators showed up and interviewed Larry. They informed him that he was a suspect in a series of murders. They stated that they had received the information from an anonymous phone call from someone who had previously known him. When asked about the murders of John Roach and Daniel McNeve, Larry stated emphatically that he had read the news reports but denied any involvement in the murders. He consented to a forensic examination of the vehicle and allowed investigators to photograph him, copy his fingerprints, and submit him to a polygraph test. Investigators found knives, nylon rope, handcuffs, hammers, baseball bats, mallets, and surgical tape in Larry's vehicle, along with other items likely used in the crime. His boots matched a plaster cast found next to Ralph Kaliza's body, and the vehicle's tire tracks matched the pattern found at the scene. Furthermore, blood was discovered beneath the handle of a knife discovered in Larry's vehicle. Larry frequently travels between 3 locations in Indiana and Illinois, where the bodies of numerous victims were also discovered. His lifestyle is an exact match for the predictions of the killer's psychological profile that the FBI put together earlier. Given these circumstances, it is clear that Larry is now a primary suspect. After a forensic examination of Larry's pickup truck, the Indiana investigators informed him that he could leave custody and keep his vehicle. However, they were concerned that Larry might mishandle potential evidence if he knew he was a murder suspect. Therefore, they obtained a search warrant to search Robert's home. The search took place in the early morning hours of October 2nd, and they found definitive evidence that Larry was involved. This included a credit card receipt showing that Larry was in Illinois and Indiana on the same day that the victim linked to the highway murderer was killed. Phone bills confirmed that Larry had received calls from Robert's home immediately following the murder of the victim. One of the calls was made from a payphone near Cook County Hospital, which matched the date of the murder of the victim, Gustavo Herrera. Hospital records show that Larry was treated for a deep cut on his hand on that date. Receipts found at the property show that he bought handcuffs and a knife the next day. Investigators also found out that Larry and Robert had been on holiday in New York for several weeks and came back to Indiana just before Kaliza was killed. Kathy Berner, who was in Indiana, told her coworkers that if Larry wasn't the murderer they were looking for, there was no way at all. Since the tire tracks from Indiana couldn't be matched to those at Kaliza's murder scene, Illinois investigators immediately impounded Larry's truck. The vehicle was impounded at Lake County Sheriff's headquarters on the evening of October 2nd, and Larry was taken to Waukegan for further questioning by investigators. He stated emphatically that the tire tracks and boot prints found at the Kaliza murder scene did not belong to him, and that he had never seen the victim. After being released on October 4th, Larry promptly sought legal counsel from Kenneth Ditkowski, a Chicago lawyer. The Lake County Deputy Chief Investigator informed Ditkowski that the police lacked sufficient evidence to formally charge his client with murder. On October 11th, Ditkowski filed a civil lawsuit against the Lake County Sheriff's Police. He also sued the Indiana State Police, stating that the lawsuit was harassing his client and investigators in both states. He asserted that it violated the 14th Amendment and his civil rights by requiring his participation in their class investigations. He also stated that there was insufficient evidence to formally charge him with murder. Finally, he declared that the lawsuit seeks $250,000 in damages against 11 named officers in both states. The boot and tire tracks found at the scene of Ralph Kaliza's murder were sent to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. for further analysis and comparison. The evidence was found as Indiana investigators worked to definitively link Larry to this murder. The FBI confirmed to investigators a few days later that the boot impression was a match. The shoe matched exactly, including 4 distinct areas of wear and damage to the sole. The blood in the shoe was also tested and confirmed to be positive for A. The tires on Larry's car were from 2 different manufacturers, and the impressions at the scene matched those 2 manufacturers. On October 27th, the investigators met to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to charge Larry with the murder. After a thorough examination of the evidence, they made the decision to charge Larry with the murder of Ralph Kaliza. The following day, the investigators obtained a warrant to take samples of Larry's blood and hair for comparison with evidence from Larry's car, which was scheduled to be served that day. That same day, a hearing was held in Ditkowski's civil suit. On October 29th, Ditkowski's civil suit was heard at the Dirksen Federal Building. He demanded that the court allow him access to the affidavit that investigators had used to apply for a search warrant for Larry's vehicle. He forcefully argued before the judge that Paul Plunkett was wrong in believing there was no probable cause against his client. After looking over the investigators' collected affidavits, Judge Plunkett firmly stated that Ditkowski couldn't see those documents right now. When Larry left the hearing, 2 Lake County investigators showed him an arrest warrant. It allowed them to collect blood and hair samples from Larry. The samples definitively showed that Larry's blood type was O positive. Larry was formally charged with Kaliza's murder on October 29th. His bail was set at $1 million, and a preliminary trial date was set for December 19th. He maintains his innocence and has made it clear in an anonymous media interview that the accusation has damaged his reputation among his family and friends. He has stated categorically that if he did murder anyone, real evidence would exist. On November 1st, Lake County investigators obtained a second search warrant for Robert's home. The main reason for this search was to find the victim's missing t-shirts and wallet to see if they'd been kept as souvenirs. Despite finding 221 items of clothing, jewelry, medications, and Polaroids, investigators found nothing that belonged to or depicted any of the victims. However, they did find a key that matched the one under Stephen Agan's body. This key fit the door to the office where Larry worked in 1982. On November 12th, attorney David Shippers was named Larry's legal representative with the approval of Larry's mother, as well as Robert and John. Shippers replaced Kenneth Ditkowski and immediately switched up the defense tactics used by his predecessor. He told his client to stop any further media interviews. In December 1983, a witness hearing before Lake County Circuit Judge William Block ruled that Larry's initial arrest for a traffic violation was lawful, but his subsequent detention was unlawful when the Indiana State Police found evidence without probable cause. Another hearing was scheduled for January 23, 1984. The purpose was to decide whether the evidence collected by investigators between September 30th and November 22nd should be thrown out and the search warrants invalidated. At a later hearing in January 1984, Chief of Police John Pavlikovic openly admitted that the main reason the Lowell police kept Larry in custody was to wait for the task force to arrive in Lowell. The investigation was looking into a series of murders. It was a fact that Larry had never been convicted of any sexual offenses other than solicitation of males. He had never been formally arrested for any offense. Further testimony confirms that the October 3rd search of John's residence by Lake County and Chicago police officers was conducted without a warrant. In 1984, Lake County investigator Dan Collins spoke with Larry's attorney, David Shippers. Judge Block's ruling resulted in the suppression of the majority of evidence against Larry. On February 1, 1984, Judge Block postponed the hearing until January 27th to consider his ruling after 4 days of testimony. He informed the assistant state's attorney and David Shippers that there was sufficient precedent for admitting and suppressing the evidence. On February 1st, Judge Block ruled that although Larry had signed a Miranda waiver, he was detained for questioning on unrelated charges and later on the solicitation charge. Citing the exclusionary rule, Judge Block ruled that the Illinois investigators compared Larry's boot prints and tire tracks to plaster found at the California crime scene. The physical evidence was found when they compared the casts. This was because the Indiana investigators had initially detained Larry unlawfully, in violation of his constitutional rights. Additionally, although the Illinois investigators obtained Larry's boots from the Indiana investigators through a subpoena, the boots were never formally seized by the Indiana authorities. Judge Block was unequivocal in stating that the police affidavit for the search of Robert's home lacked the necessary information to obtain a search warrant. Block stated that all other evidence must be excluded, with the exception of the tire impressions, hair, and blood samples from Larry. On this date, Judge Block also reduced Larry's total bail to $10,000. As a result of this decision, Larry was released on February 6, 1984, with his family and Robert bearing the cost of the reduced bond. The terms of Larry's bond prohibited him from leaving Illinois. The prosecutor attempted to appeal the decision, arguing that the evidence should not be admitted in court. He also sought to take the case to the United States Supreme Court, but these appeals were unsuccessful. 4 weeks after he was released from custody, Larry moved to Chicago and took up residence in an apartment complex in Rogers Park. Robert was in charge of buying the furniture, paying the weekly rent, and getting new tires for Larry's pickup truck. His lawyer told him not to tell John where he lived, but John found out where Larry was. On the evening of August 19, 1984, around 10:30 p.m., Larry lured a 16-year-old boy named Daniel Bridges, a male sex worker, to his apartment. Once he got him back to his apartment, Larry tied Daniel to a chair, beat him up, and tortured him. He killed Daniel by stabbing him to death. Then, Larry dismembered Daniel's body in the bathroom and put each piece in a separate plastic bag. On the morning of August 21, 1984, a janitor named Joseph Bala discovered the dismembered body of Daniel in a dumpster near Larry's apartment. It was also placed in a unit that wasn't intended for tenants. Bala initially thought the bags were just illegally dumped garbage, so he removed them and looked inside. He found a severed human leg. He immediately called the police and informed them that other janitors had seen Larry put the bags in the dumpster the previous afternoon. The police then arrested Larry. A forensic examination showed that the bedroom in Larry's apartment had been cleaned recently, but there was still blood on the floors, walls, and ceiling, which was clearly from a recent repainting. There was no doubt that Daniel's blood was found on the mattress, the chair, the belt, the couch in the room, and under the floorboards in the bathroom doorway. Investigators found blood-stained jeans and a distinctive Duke University t-shirt in Larry's closet that were indisputably Daniel's. They also found hacksaws and other tools at the scene. A forensic examination of the concealment bag definitively revealed Larry's fingerprints on both the inside and the outside. On August 24th, investigators conducted a luminol test outside of the bag. The test revealed a large amount of blood in the bedroom and clear markings on the floor indicating that Daniel's body had been dragged from the bedroom into the bathtub to be dismembered. On August 22nd, Larry was formally charged with murdering Daniel. He vehemently denied any involvement in the crime, asserting that his fingerprints may have been left behind when he touched the bag containing Daniel's body by mistake. On the same day, the Cook County medical examiner performed an autopsy on Daniel's body. The autopsy definitively confirmed that Daniel died from multiple stab wounds and wounds caused by a conical tool. The autopsy also revealed that he had sustained facial fractures, signs of battery around his right eye, numerous superficial cuts to his face, multiple stab wounds to his chest and abdomen, stab wounds to his back, and a punctured heart and left lung. Prosecutors Mark Riccocci and Rick Stock are seeking the death penalty for Larry at his upcoming trial. They've charged him with felony counts of aggravated kidnapping, unlawful detainment, and concealment of Daniel's body, in addition to the murder charge. Larry was tried on July 1, 1986, and unequivocally pleaded not guilty to all charges. He was represented by two public defenders, Claire Hilliard and Tom Allen, with David Shippers also providing legal services pro bono. The first witness for the prosecution to take the stand was Robert. He stated that he worked at Larry's business between August 17th and 19th, and then returned to Terre Haute around 10:15 p.m. on the night of Daniel's murder. On July 2nd, Robert Stein, Ph.D., gave compelling evidence for the prosecution. He described the torture and mutilation of Daniel as one of the worst cases he had ever seen, and stated that the saw teeth found on the body were an exact match. It matched the hacksaw blade found in Larry's apartment. In cross-examination, Steen informed Tom Allen that he had found traces of alcohol and cocaine in the victim's bloodstream. This proved that the victim had not been abducted but had gone into Larry's apartment voluntarily. On July 4th, Al Berditsky, the janitor, stated definitively that on August 20th, he saw Larry go to his shared locker 8 to 12 times. Larry stated that he was getting tools for a job. A few hours later, Berditsky saw Larry go to the dumpster 3 times. On July 7th, John gave evidence for the prosecution. He stated that he had called Larry 3 times between 8:45 p.m. and 11:25 p.m. on the night Daniel disappeared. He also called Larry again on August 20th at 2:45 a.m. Larry told him that John said he shouldn't visit because Larry was still with Robert, which was unusual because Robert usually got back to Terre Haute early on Sundays. John also said that during the last call he told Larry he'd be there in 15 minutes, but Larry said, "No, don't do that." Then Larry said he'd be over to John's house right away. When Larry got there, John noticed that he'd probably taken a shower recently. John wasn't interested in having sex because he thought Larry was with another guy. John's testimony was quickly backed up by other evidence. He said that Robert had left Larry's apartment about 15 minutes before Daniel was last seen alive. Robert's lawyer presented evidence to back up his claim that he left Larry's apartment on the evening of August 19th. This included a tax receipt showing that Robert paid his property taxes on his Terre Haute apartment at noon on August 20th. The jury spent about 3 hours deliberating before reaching a verdict. Larry was found guilty of concealing the teenager's body, aggravated kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and murder. On October 3rd, the judge handed down the death penalty to be carried out by lethal injection. He said, "The senseless and barbaric murder of a 16-year-old boy, a brutal murder so cruel that it defies description, shows you have no regard for human life. If there is one person or circumstance that lends itself to the death penalty, it is you. You are an evil person. You truly deserve to die for your actions. Therefore, I sentence you to death for the murder of Daniel during his aggravated kidnapping." After sentencing, Larry was transferred to the Pontiac Correctional Center. He underwent several psychiatric evaluations, which definitively concluded that he suffered from severe borderline personality disorder. The tests also confirmed that Larry has a pathological sensitivity to feelings. The experts were unequivocal in their assessment that Larry killed in response to his loved one's feelings of rejection, releasing his anger on the victim. They were certain that he killed to maintain a sense of control. In November 1990, prosecutor Larry Thomas obtained physical evidence in the Ralph Calais murder case that he was certain was connected to Larry. He showed it to an Indiana grand jury to charge Larry with the December 1982 murder of Stephen Egan. When Larry learned he was going to be tried for Egan's murder, he agreed to confess to the crime on his own. However, he made it clear that Robert helped him do it. Larry agreed to plead guilty and testify against his accomplice Robert on the condition that his lethal injection be exchanged for a fixed term of imprisonment without parole. After his terms were accepted, Larry provided a comprehensive 17-page confession to his attorney on December 4th. Ultimately, Larry was sentenced on December 28th to 60 years in prison to be served concurrently with his existing sentence. Robert was arrested on December 18th and formally charged with first-degree murder in the case of Stephen Egan. If convicted, he could also face 60 years in prison. Robert was tried on April 11, 1991, and formally pleaded guilty before Judge Doan Darnell. Larry provided testimony against Robert at the trial, claiming that he and Robert had collaborated to commit Egan's murder on December 19, 1982. Larry described the process of seducing Egan, and at Robert's direction, Larry committed the murder. Robert also documented the process with a camera. At trial, Robert's defense attorney, Dennis Zan, questioned Larry's motives, noting that he may have framed Robert in order to reduce his own sentence. Additionally, Zan introduced evidence that Robert was not present at the time of Egan's murder. Subsequently, the jury found Robert not guilty of all charges on April 17th. Following his acquittal, Robert stated that he was gratified that the ordeal was over and planned to return to Indiana State University to resume his teaching duties. Larry died in the infirmary of the Pontiac Correctional Center on March 6, 1994, from AIDS-related complications.